Horror is my favorite genre across all media. It does things that other genres can't. They can scare the ever-living shit out of you, but they can also be profound and thought-provoking, or hilarious and insane. Like any genre, it encompasses a wide range of styles and content. In games, horror has been around for a long time, and while there have been periods where they disappeared for a bit, they never truly left. Lately, they've been making a bit of a comeback to the mainstream, and with it, we've seen a few conversations rear their head again. Since I found myself cooped up for the next while, I've found myself going through a whole heap of games, and I have to get the demons out of my head somehow. So let's talk about what I believe makes a good horror game and give you some recommendations.
You can't fight them. You have to hide.
I want to preface this section by stating that I am not, nor do I claim to be, an expert on anything, but I like to think that I've played enough horror games to have a good go at what makes good horror. Of course, just like any other media, not all horror games are the same. Some horror games are mostly passive experiences, making the player avoid threats rather than combat them, and others want you to go all guns blazing. Some don't even have enemies, instead allowing the player to journey through at their own pace. Horror is a personal experience. What creeps you out may not creep me out. You might be terrified and disgusted by gore and viscera, or you might find the slow, existential horror more frightening. Whatever makes your skin crawl is horror to you, and that's what matters. The only thing I will say is that it needs to be the focus of the game. We all know a game or two that has a scary level or area, but if that's only a tiny portion of the larger game, then it's not a horror game. Despite their differences, there are a few things that games have in common which decide whether they are good horror, and that's what we're getting into now.
No offense to the man, but I sometimes worry he might just be a little bit crazy.
Time is easily the most important aspect of any horror game, which makes a lot of sense. Horror is all about suspense and payoff. It's long, creeping hallway shots followed by a big scare. Much like good comedy, good horror is all about timing. But that's not the only reason time is important. We're also discussing game length. Game length is one of those conversations that appears every so often in game discussion, however, a lot of people are talking about it in the sense of value. Sure, when you're buying a €60 game, you probably want to get your money's worth, but that's not really what I'm talking about. Horror is absolutely one of those genres where the adage less is more applies, and it's always been this way. Resident Evil 3 Remake recently saw people crying for more playtime, without considering that the original PS1 trilogy barely reaches the 8-hour mark. A lot of these old PS1 survival horror games rely on replay value, either by switching up the character you play as or by having multiple endings, but not all horror games take this approach. To clarify, I haven't played 3 Remake yet, and I'm aware there are more criticisms than just the length, but I feel that a lot of people have been focusing on it as a negative. To show you what I mean, let's do a quick experiment. Here's what Google spits out when you search horror games of all time. The reason I like this list is because it's not only a pretty good representation of popularity, it also gives us a nice spread. There's a game here from each of the past few console generations, plus you've got some indie games thrown in there too. Now let's take the stats from How Long to Beat and see what we can gather. Out of the 15 games we're using, only 5 of them breached the 10-hour mark, with Resident Evil 4 and Alien Isolation being the 2 biggest outliers. Nearly half of the list fits neatly into the 7 to 9 hour bracket, with the shortest being only 3.5 hours. There's no correlation between release dates, as the second longest game came out in 2005, while some of the shorter games came out more than a decade later. So you're probably thinking, wow Sean, you really just put all those numbers on screen. What's the point? Quite simply, horror works best when it's as short and tight as possible. Ever wonder why short horror stories are so scary? You know that famous quote about fear? The oldest and strongest emotion of humanity is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Fear of the unknown is an extremely important rule of horror. It's what makes characters like Michael Myers so scary. An unstoppable, seemingly invincible killing machine with no weaknesses. One that can get shot multiple times and still survive. The more you explain the monster and the more you establish rules, the less scary they become. How does this apply to games? The difference between a passive experience like a movie or a book is that you have no agency. You can't change the course of the story. You're left to experience the story through the eyes of a protagonist who is unable to take your advice. In a game, however, when you're being chased by some unholy creature, you have choices. The first time you see Pyramid Head in Silent Hill 2, he seems like an unstoppable terror, but by the end of the game, you're taking him out with relative ease with a few well-placed shots of your rifle. Some games get around this by making it so you can't fight the creature at all. In Amnesia, your only choice is to be as quiet as possible, to avoid the enemies while also managing your sanity, meaning you can't just hide in the shadows forever. This can work for a while, but in the long run, constantly avoiding enemies and having no way to stop them can get a little frustrating, and it can be extremely draining for the player. There's a sweet spot between giving the player too much power while also not making them feel powerless, and that's something that becomes harder the longer the game is. Good horror games to me exist in this beautiful balance of time and power. Longer games don't stop scaring you after the first hour. They continue to push your buttons by unnerving you right up until the end. On the flip side, very short horror games tend to be between an hour or two long, instead condensing the terror down into a really short, digestible package. You don't have enough time to get used to it, leaving you on the edge the entire time. Some games will abuse this dynamic, what you might call the YouTuber bait horror games. These games will often be extremely short and chock full of jump scares, and while their heyday has mostly passed, back in the early 2010s a huge slew of indie horror games in particular were following this path. Take one of the biggest examples, Slender the 8 Pages. Slender is not a well-designed game. It is a game specifically designed to scare you. There is no win condition. Whether you collect one page or all 8, you get caught in the end. They're a quick thrill, and some people love that. But when you compare Slender and its many other copies and clones, to even games like Amnesia and Outlast, which came out around the same time, they don't hold a candle anymore, because they're, at best, a cheap thrill, and at worst, extremely frustrating.
My mouse flipped me around!
Allow me to explain this further with some of my favorite horror games. Before I do though, here's a quickfire list of games I need to mention but are either hugely famous, and I'd be saying stuff you already know, or I've mentioned them previously in this video. Devotion may be one of the scariest things I've ever experienced. This first-person puzzle game takes place in Taiwan in the 1980s, and sees you traveling to different years in the lives of a family to piece together their story. Most of the game involves solving puzzles and discovering notes, and not running away from some monster. Most of the time anyway. The environments are haunting, the scares are perfectly timed, and the story is unbelievably good. The way the game plays with perspective and some genuinely amazing set pieces makes it one of the best horror games of the last decade. The only thing more tragic than the ending is the story surrounding the game's release. But don't let that stop you from experiencing this fantastic game. It's hard to find a game as unnerving as Kitty Horror Show's Anatomy. The game is quite simple. Explore an empty house and listen to the tapes you find along the way. I won't say much more because it's easily the shortest game on this list, and it's much better experienced than talked about. It's a slow, creeping horror that you don't find as often. There's no puzzles or weapons, all you have to do is explore, and listen to the story unfold. The only advice I'll give you is that it's not always over when you think it is. A masterclass in atmosphere, Anatomy is a great little gem that I highly recommend checking out.
The bedroom seems less like a mind and more like a mouth. For it is here that the house is most likely to betray us. It is here that we place ourselves most at the house's mercy and spend each night hoping that it will not bite down.
There's something very creepy about working a night shift all alone, and that's exactly what the convenience store capitalizes on. This Japanese horror game will definitely be up your alley if you're a fan of the Grudge or Ring styles of horror. It's a simple game about a college girl on a night shift, and as the Steam description states, it is a psychological horror. The game will drive you insane. Questionable English aside, while I can't say it drove me insane, it did creep me out. The VHS filter definitely makes the game scarier, and the models used for the other characters give it that uncanny appearance. It doesn't overstay its welcome, and it doesn't give you a moment to rest, making it worthy of a look. The PS2 is a goldmine for classic horror games, and one game that a lot of people may have overlooked is Rule of Rose. If I had to say which game on this list genuinely unnerves me the most, I would have to say it's this one. The game came out quite late into the PS2's life, and the cutscenes reflect this. They look absolutely amazing, and this only amplifies the creepiness of the story. While it has got its issues, particularly with its gameplay, the rest of the package makes it worth getting through to see the other side. Sadly, this game is more famous for being extremely hard to get your hands on, seeing as it was nearly banned in the UK before it was released. Despite the controversy being primarily fear-mongering and exaggerations, I will say that the plot and themes of Rule of Rose are genuinely disturbing. These kids are some of the creepiest characters I've ever seen, and watching Jennifer get pushed around and abused by them is genuinely hard to watch at points. If you can stomach that and the questionable design choices, you'll find a beautiful story with some really poignant moments, on top of some of the creepiest shit I've seen in a while. Some people may think Dead Space belongs in the list of popular horror games that I listed off earlier, up there with your Resident Evils, but I think the original Dead Space doesn't get quite as much kudos. Before EA did what they do best and killed off the franchise, Dead Space 1 was an amazingly frightening experience. In fact, I'd argue it's one of the best horror games on the PS3. At the time, horror franchises were trying to balance being more action-focused, and most of them failed miserably, or just dropped the pretense of being a horror game at all. Dead Space gives you lots of weapons, but that doesn't make it any less scary. The horrifying creature designs, the mechanics of shooting their limbs off to slow them down, and the visceral kill animations make Dead Space not only a really fun time, but also an extremely tense one. Being stuck on the SS Ishimura gives the game the horror and atmosphere of Alien, while the general gameplay sneaks closer to Alien's territory. As far as more action-based horror goes, you can't go wrong with Dead Space. When I first heard of World of Horror, I imagined it was a gimmick. A fun little early access game that you'd play once or twice and be done with it. But then I played it. World of Horror is an adventure game at heart, with gorgeous pixel art, creepy music, roguelike gameplay, and a hefty sprinkling of Ito and Lovecraft influence. Each run has you play a different character investigating 5 mysteries selected randomly from the game's list, along with a different old god, each with different effects on your game. As you investigate the different stories around town, the doom meter slowly ticks up, and you witness horrors that will cause you to lose your sanity or damage you physically. While the mysteries are the same each time, what actions you take or items you pick up will allow you to see different endings, so replaying them is rewarding. Each time you choose a location, a random event is selected, which could result in your character rolling a stat check, or just making a choice, resulting in positive or negative effects. The game nails that distinct otherworldly style with cryptic messages and seemingly impossible moments. One minute you're exploring a mansion when a tear in reality leads you to a fallen civilization straight out of the Nameless City, testing your character's reason and sanity. Or perhaps more unnerving than that, your character may receive a strange letter in the post, which upon opening gives you the simple dialogue, "You've attracted the attention of something truly evil." It's the vague moments that don't have any immediate effect that are the most unsettling, and World of Horror excels in these departments. Even for the art alone, give this game a chance. There are 2 types of people right now. People who have heard of Yume Nikki and know what I'm about to say, and people who are looking at this footage thinking, how is this scary? Yume Nikki is the prime example of surreal horror. It has no real enemies, there's no way to die, you can't even really do a lot to interact with the world. Instead, you wander around the dreams of the main character and explore the worlds within. Simple, right? You can collect items along the way, and there is an ending you can achieve by following some vague hints, but all in all there isn't really anything to do except explore and see what you stumble across. It's the empty worlds and grotesque imagery of her dreams that makes Yume Nikki such a frightening game. When I first played it, I found myself enamored with the world and trying to figure out what all this dark imagery means. The esoteric and nonsensical nature of the world makes discovering new areas feel like you're stumbling into somewhere you shouldn't be, and the lack of any dialogue or real interaction makes it an awfully lonely experience. Yume Nikki is the definition of a cult classic. It's weird, it's unsettling, and it's got a huge fan base of diehard fans who pick apart every little piece of the game. If you don't believe me, try visiting Ponyco in the Pink Sea and switching off the light switch, or try hanging around in the White Desert and see what might happen. To conclude, I want to reiterate something that I mentioned earlier on in the video. Horror is subjective. The list of games I just provided you with aren't necessarily my favourite horror games, there's just a few that I think are definitely worth a look if you've played all the heavy hitters already. Time and power are still two very important aspects to me, but they are not the be-all end-all. When I sat down to write the first draft of this video, I set out to define what makes good horror, and I had all these categories and characteristics, but at some point I realised how pointless that all was. At the end of the day, while there are rules to making effective horror, they aren't the only option. Even my own list breaks some of these rules. In Yume you are ultimately powerless, but there are no real threats. You can't die. World of Horror is so heavily reliant on RNG that you can either end up extremely overpowered or extremely underpowered depending on luck. Something I've come to terms with over the course of making this video is how limited my outlook on horror has kind of been. If you were to ask someone what a horror game is like, you could get a few different answers. They're first-person games where you get chased by a monster and jump-scared all the time. Or maybe they're fixed-camera, atmospheric action games with puzzle and inventory management. If you're making a horror game, maybe you want to take what I said earlier into account. It's worked for a lot of extremely popular horror games in the past. Many of the biggest trends in horror games definitely utilize them at a base level. Or you could throw them to the wind. Make your own style. Try something different. Becoming too focused on genre is a pitfall for a lot of media. There's a reason why tropes have become an easy way to make fun of certain trends. So, to answer the question I posed at the beginning, what makes good horror? You could say it's a balance of player and enemy power. You could say it's a slow burn that builds up over time. You could even say it's about a quick thrill and a jump scare. It could be a combination of all of these things, or it could be something entirely different that I've not thought of. This may seem like a bit of a cop-out, but maybe it's just like your opinion, man. Thanks for watching. Well, there you have it. Some of my favourite horror games and what I consider to be the most important aspects of horror. If you've got any thoughts on what makes good horror, then let me know. And if you've got a recommendation for something that I might like, then leave a comment. I know there are other reasons why people play horror games beyond just being scared, and I'd love to tackle games like Resident Evil 6 at a later date, that are horror but not trying to be scary, but that'll have to wait a while. Anyways, thank you for watching, and stay safe.
失望的人，这次没能。